Beneath the long span of this ministry swept the swift current of the years, bearing on its bosom multitudinous changes in our city, in our congregation, in the sphere of human endeavor, in the realm of religious thought and Christian activities. But the loyalty of this church to its minister and its devotions to the various interests of the kingdom has been unchanging and true. Today there surges in our hearts a flood tide of memories on which we dare not cast a lingering look. For your hearty and consistent cooperation, for your charitable indulgence, for your gracious courtesies, for your generous hospitality, for your countless expressions of appreciation, for your priceless friendship, your pure and unselfish affection, the retiring minister and his family offer you their gratitude and their hearts to have and to hold always.
In December of 1926, after over 22 years of service to the congregations at 4th Street and Madison Avenue, Joseph W. Hagan announced his resignation. In many ways, Hagan could be credited for the existence of MACC. He had come to 4th Street in 1904 at the youthful age of 29 and oversaw the 1912 union of 4th Street and Central Christian that became Madison Avenue Christian Church.
Well, of course, Hagan came to 4th Street Christian Church in 1904 as a 29-year-old minister, 3 years of experience as a minister. And he was certainly well-liked and became a huge leader, civic leader in Covington. And as time went on, the church had been thinking about building a new church, and I think that was something that he was interested in as well. And so he was very important in the negotiations with Central Christian Church along about 1911, which brought the two churches together and formed Madison Avenue Christian Church. My feeling is that he was a very formal minister. You can certainly see from his picture the high collar that he wore throughout his career. His dignified. His sermons were very intellectual, not of the emotional style. So I think he was just right for the type of people in the congregation of Madison Avenue.
Under Hagan's leadership, the church had thrived, but as the 1930s approached, he felt the church needed more youthful leadership. In early 1927, with Hagan's support, the board selected 37-year-old Reverend Kenneth Bowen to be the church's second minister. Originally from North Carolina, Bowen advocated youth programming and missionary work. His wife, Annalie, was heavily involved in church activities, emphasizing religious drama and missionary work.
The Reverend Bowen came, and he was an entirely different person. You felt like you could talk to him, laugh with him, and he was a father of 3 children, which made a difference too. Reverend Hagan's children were growing, and I think that made a difference. Not that Reverend Hagan wasn't fine, he was. We just didn't relate, to youngsters, but Reverend Bowen and I did.
The church continued to thrive throughout the 1920s, but with as many as 25 Sunday school classes, the building proved inadequate. In the spring of 1929, the church board approved a plan to build a new educational wing at the back of the existing church building.
It was actually the youth of the church that petitioned to have the education building built as classrooms for them. However, I have a pretty good feeling that it was Bowen who put them up to that task.
The new education wing was completed by the spring of 1930, but by then, the nation found itself in the throes of the Great Depression.
So once we got started on building the educational building, it was 6 months later, right in the midst of the construction, that the Great Depression hit. And it was very, very difficult. They plowed ahead. They were deeply in debt. And it's something that weighed very heavily on Kenneth Bowen during his time here. He and Mrs. Bowen requested a huge drop in salary. At times, that was not accepted by the church, with the feeling we'd get by somehow. At other times, it was actually part of it. I think that there were few years from 1929 on when he actually received his full salary at Madison Avenue Christian Church.
In 1945, Bowen announced his resignation to accept the prestigious post as president of Transylvania University. Church leaders soon selected Reverend Barton Johnson from Missouri as his successor.
Barton Johnson was a very dignified leader of the church, and I think those people who were in the church at that time can recall him with very formal clothes. After one of his sermons, he would walk in a dignified manner down from the stage area, pass by Mrs. Johnson, hold out his arm, and the two of them would stroll out to the back of the church.
MACC thrived during the 2 decades of the Johnson ministry. Attendance was high, the youth program was strong, and the church offered a wide range of activities, such as women's circles, choir, and even an active men's group, the Men of MACC. Like Mrs. Bowen, Vivian Johnson played a key role in the church's success in that era.
His wife, another good example, Vivian Johnson, of one who was tremendously talented in so many different ways. And there are people who would say that she was as important, if not more important, to his ministry than was Reverend Johnson. She, of course, started the Mr. and Mrs. class, possibly the most successful Sunday school class in the history of MACC. Typically, they would have meeting in the dining room area downstairs, typically 50 or 60 people on a Sunday morning. And Mrs. Johnson was at the very center of that group of people who became the leaders of Madison Avenue for the next 20 or 30 years.
In 1965, after serving for 20 years as minister, Reverend Johnson retired. After a 2-year interim period, the church hired Reverend Lawrence Crane as its 4th minister.
It's very difficult to characterize the Crane years because of the brevity. He was only here for 3 years and died suddenly of a stroke at the age of 41. During the time that he was here, there was a tremendous emphasis on youth programming, quite a large youth group at that time. Emphasis on community and community youth. As far as his style, he had a very eloquent, lyrical style, and we have a number of his sermons preserved till this day in written form. But they were beautiful, often very poetic.
3 years plus 2 months, scarcely more than 1,000 days. It was 1967 when Reverend Crane was called to become the 4th minister of the Venerable Christian Church on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. He preached from the high pulpit in front of the resounding pipe organ, the pews filled with first families and newcomers as the bright Sunday morning sun streamed through the magnificent stained glass windows. On the first Mother's Day, his son and 10 other babies were dedicated. On his last Easter, he baptized his older daughter. And her mother remembers when their 3-year-old asked, "Is God bigger than Daddy?" The minister led the drive for a new parking lot so more children and youth could come to Sunday school. He served on district and state committees to promote fair housing and feed the poor, joined the Lions Club, and opened civic meetings with prayer. And he preached sermons like "Before the Trumpets Blow" and "You Too Can Walk on Water." Then suddenly he was gone. God had called the preacher daddy home, felled by a stroke at 41. The stalwart church was without its shepherd. Then the flock became 1,000 shepherds enfolding his young family in their loving, protective arms. Over and over and over again, showing that we were all a part of the MACC family, the family of God. Sarah Crane Fector.
After the sudden death of Reverend Crane in 1970, the church called on Reverend Robert Anderson to become its fifth minister. Although by this time much of the Covington population had moved to the suburbs, the church remained vibrant.
Madison Avenue continued to be very strong during the Anderson years. The lay leadership was particularly strong, and a lot of those people were ones who had gotten their start in the Mr. and Mrs. class during the Johnson years. So now all of these people were leading various committees, taking on roles as chairman of the board and so on. So it remained very, very strong. Anderson had a quiet but eloquent in his own way leadership as a minister. The church had some very bold ideas during the Anderson years. There were proposals to change radically the front of the church, to remove the front steps and make it a little bit more accessible from the street level. There was a proposal to build a senior citizens home on one of the parcels of land that we had purchased close to the church. Several other ideas, changes in the board. Those changes were not well received and were voted down. It's interesting, one of the leaders of that time, Marshall Gooch, told me years later that many of the proposals were voted in later on, but piecemeal, not as one particular idea. I don't know if that had anything to do with the decision of Anderson to leave after 7 years, but Reverend Anderson had a theory that 7 years was about the right period of time for a minister to be at a church. And so after 7 years, he moved on to Waycross, Georgia.
In 1978, 29-year-old Dr. Philip Miller was chosen as Anderson's successor. The inexperienced Miller was faced with the tough challenge of maintaining an inner-city church as the flight to the suburbs continued.
And Phil Miller was 29 years old. Before he accepted the position, he came to Madison Avenue for an interview, of course, and requested to meet with the people in the church who were in their 20s and 30s. And we met out at Jerry Hatfield's house and had a wonderful give and take with Phil and his wife Paula and a fairly large group of people. And it was because of that meeting that Phil felt like it was a good move to come to Madison Avenue. It's interesting that in years later I talked to Phil and he characterized his years as giving him on-the-job training. 29-year-old minister, first church. There were some wonderful things, probably some things he preferred to do over again, but overall the church was very strong during those years. Sometime during the first year of his ministry, he has pointed out that the church averaged 225 in attendance at worship services on Sunday. This was around Easter, so I'm sure that was one of the Sundays he was talking about. So things were going very well. However, the attendance continued the overall trend, and by the time the end of his ministry came, the average was about 165. But he was good in all aspects of the ministry. He was a good speaker. He was good at working with various people, probably better at working with younger and middle-aged people than with older people, better at working with people more his age. But he and Paula were a very important part of the church and remain dearly loved by many people in the congregation.
In 1985, Miller accepted the call to a church in Paducah. After an extended interim period, the church leaders chose Reverend Peter Moon, who had worked in New York the previous decade. In the early years of Moon's ministry, the church celebrated its 75th anniversary and completed several ambitious building improvement projects. Attendance continued its decline, however, and divisions arose in the church. In 1990, Moon moved on to a church in Kenwood. Following Moon's departure, Reverend J. Michael Delaney served as the interim. Delaney had grown up at MACC and had been considering leaving the ministry, but his dynamic speaking style won over the congregation, and he became the full-time minister in 1991.
Mike was an excellent speaker, is an excellent speaker, and it was a good change from, there were some people in the church who wanted a more forceful, dynamic speaker, and that was Mike.
The 1990s were tough times at MACC, where weekly attendance often dipped below 100. It was also a period of leadership transition, as a new generation of leaders took the reins. Over time, it became clear that a new MACC had emerged.
It reached probably a low point, maybe around 1995, something like that, about the time that John Kreitler became moderator of the church. And it's possible to look at that period of time as kind of a very slow rebirth of MACC. John Kreitler, as chair of the Long Range Planning Committee, put together a plan to revitalize the church and to focus us on our mission. And that was accepted by the congregation in 1997. And that has aimed us in the direction of the mission, and although it's not specifically exactly what has happened at Madison Avenue today, it is kind of focused on those ideas. At one of the down periods, I actually talked to John Kreitler on the phone and said, you know, there are some people who are concerned about certain aspects of Mike's ministry. And I asked him what he thought. And John paused and said, I believe that Mike Delaney is a prophet. That was pretty well the end of that conversation. And what John meant, I believe, by that is that a lot of times a prophet is not accepted in their own town, in their own church. And Mike gave sermons that were not feel-good sermons. They sometimes made you angry and made you think, certainly. You didn't always leave church with a good feeling. And maybe that's what Madison Avenue needed at that time, as we were ending a period of traditional ministries, wonderful traditional ministries, and heading toward a new beginning. Sometimes a church has to die, or almost die, in order for a rebirth to take place.
By the time Mike Delaney left in 2003, MACC had started a successful inclusion ministry and had begun to turn its gaze to the needs of the community in Covington. The hiring of Reverend Chinamuthu Simon in 2004 further solidified MACC's rebirth.
And we decided to go for the strongest minister in the entire country that we could, that was available. Didn't make any difference, gender, experience, whatever. We wanted to take a look at who could be the strongest leader, no matter what it might cost, for Madison Avenue Christian Church. And it didn't take too long to find Reverend Simon. You sometimes don't realize the influence that he has on various projects, and then when you think back, you realize just a little nudge here, a little nudge there, to help get things moving. And I think he's a huge reason why we as a church have been able to accomplish so much in 9 years.
Under the quiet leadership of Simon, MACC has undergone a complete transformation leading up to its centennial. While 15 years ago, many members may have questioned whether we'd make it to 100 years, the past decade has taught us that if anything, the next century can be even better than the first.